recall that in a previous episode, I said that there were three main habitat types on planet Earth, those being marine, then terrestrial, and freshwater.
But it could be argued that there's in fact a fourth type of habitat that came into being since life on Earth first evolved. Because there are some animals that turn up their noses at living in marine, freshwater, or terrestrial environments, they choose to live somewhere else. But where do they live? Other organisms.
They are known as parasites. Some, like this tick and this well-fed leech, live on other organisms. Others, like this nematode worm, choose to live in other organisms. But no matter what kind of parasite they are, they all use their hosts' bodies as habitat and food. Parasitism, therefore, brings about the prospect of recognizing a fourth habitat type, other organisms. So, first and foremost, when we're thinking about the host body as a habitat, we can think of either being on the outside of the body, in which case we're talking about ectoparasites. Alternatively, they could be living on the inside of the other organism, in which case we call them endoparasites. So, like other habitats that we've come to know on planet Earth, host organisms provide unique properties of these habitat types that may create certain advantages to becoming a parasite, but also certain challenges that need to be overcome in order to satisfy their needs. One of the important ones for being able to be a parasite would require being able to attach oneself onto the host or to find a way to embed oneself into the tissues of that host. Secondly, once they are associated with the host, there's often the requirement of dealing with the host's immune system, which will be responding to the intruder and trying to destroy or dislodge it. Therefore, adaptations will be required in some instances to allow parasitic organisms, particularly endoparasites, to defend themselves against their host's immune system. Additionally, given that the habitat within organisms in particular can be a lonely place, it can often be difficult to find sexual partners. So, the parasite may need to develop adaptations that favor reproduction in situations where finding sexual partners may be a limiting factor. Also, with respect to reproduction, in order to complete the life cycle, oftentimes it requires finding a new host and some way of getting to that host. So, we will note that there will likely be adaptations with respect to all of these features in order to promote the parasitic lifestyle. In terms of ectoparasites, being those that feed on the outside of other organisms, we have several animals that do so, starting, for example, with the arthropods. We have ticks, like the ones you saw earlier, and the closely related mites, or insects, like these human head lice. They're all common ectoparasites. Ticks are usually blood feeders on the outside of animals, known as hematophagous, whereas mites, such as this very hungry-looking herd of dust mites, largely will feed either in detritus, such as our carpets, or in the case of plant parasites, on the surface of leaves, similar to these aphids. Other ectoparasites in the arthropod phylum, for example, might be fleas or lice, which are very well adapted to clinging to hairs and feeding on the organic material that's found within the hair coat of mammals. But ectoparasites are not limited to these arthropods. We have ectoparasites in the vertebrate groups as well. As an example, and a rather visceral one at that, we have the lampreys, or jawless fish of the order Petromyzontiformes. As you see very clearly here, lampreys have cyclostome mouths, which means a round mouth covered in hooks and teeth. In the center is a retractable tongue with very sharp teeth of its own. All these teeth allow the lamprey to attach onto their host, which is usually a fish or some other vertebrates in the water. sometimes turtles. The lamprey latch onto the skin of their host, such as this lake trout, using their sharp, hook-like teeth. They activate the tongue to punch a hole in the side of their host, then feed on the tissues and the blood and other fluids from within. As for endoparasites, there are many more to be discussed. In fact, most plants and animals on planet Earth are known to be hosts for various kinds of endoparasites, and will in one way or another be afflicted by endoparasites at some point in their life. One important group of endoparasites are the nematodes. Nematoda is a phylum of roundworms who happen to be pseudocoelomates as well, meaning that they do have a coelom cavity in their body, but this body cavity is not entirely enclosed in mesoderm. And so the movement of these worms is limited to side-to-side thrashing. It also places tremendous pressure on their digestive tract because of the lack of mesoderm or muscle to protect it from those exerted pressures. So, in terms of locomotion, it's not very effective if they're free-living out in the world. But if they're within the bodies of other organisms, whether plants or animals, the environment offers enough resistance from side to side for this wriggling locomotion to be relatively effective for getting from one place to another. Some kinds of nematodes may affect humans, including intestinal worms. Intestinal worms like these are essentially those in which the adult worms will feed with us on the food within our intestines and reproduce in there. Their life cycle includes a phase outside of the human body where the eggs are excreted in the feces and find themselves in the external environment. For the cycle to complete, at some point there needs to be an infection back into a new human, for example, with a very small larva penetrating the fine-skinned areas between our toes as we walk in the grass barefoot. From there, it would migrate through the circulatory system to find its way into the lungs. Once we have these young larva worms in our lungs, they would wriggle up the trachea into our mouth, where they are then swallowed. And that is the means by which they get from the circulatory system into the digestive system in order to complete the life cycle by feeding within that digestive system, finding another mate, and reproducing in there, and then releasing the eggs in the feces back into the environment to begin the cycle again. Some nematode worms are actually causes of important public health concerns via diseases in the world, including elephantiasis, which is a form of a filarial worm, meaning very, very thin worms that often will become lodged and block lymphatic tissues that cause incredible swellings in the downstream limbs from those lymphatic areas. We know this syndrome as elephantiasis because of the elephant-like limbs that it creates from those big accumulations of lymphatic tissue. Interestingly, completing the life cycle for this particular nematode worm requires the help of an insect vector or taxi. And that vector is mosquitoes, which, while biting an infected person, will pick up the microfiliary larvae or tiny little immature worms. And the mosquitoes will transfer them to another individual upon their next blood meal, at which point the microfilarial worms will then migrate through the circulatory system and into the lymphatic nodes again. So we see another example of this ingenuity in adaptations, this time using a third-party vector, with respect to finding a means to complete the life cycle, and to be able to achieve the reproductive needs in these organisms that live hidden away in the bodies of their hosts. It's not just humans nor animals that are hosts for endoparasites. Many insects are parasitic on plants, including those that produce galls. Galls, like the one in this goldenrod, are immune responses by plants that have had an egg laid in their tissues, whether it's a wasp or a fly laying the eggs, in a leaf or a stem. The response from the plant to surface chemicals on the ovipositor, like that of this gall wasp, and of the egg that it has laid within it, trigger a growth of tissue that swells around that egg, such as we see here. For the parasite, this has the convenient effect of protecting that egg for the larval development, as well as feeding it on the tissues of the gall from within its protective chamber. These are some very interesting examples of parasitism in which the organism not just takes advantage of its host for feeding, but also manipulates its immune system in such a way that it benefits the parasite's own life cycle. In a previous episode, we saw flatworms, the first group of organisms that evolved mesoderm in our Lophotrochozoan clade. We had only spoken about the free-living flatworms. However, there are also many parasitic flatworms that are endoparasites of vertebrates and invertebrates alike. For example, in the Trematode class, there are many endoparasites commonly known as flukes, that will feed upon the cells of their hosts as adult flatworms. And as such, we would note that there are oral suckers and claspers and hooks allowing them to embed themselves into the tissues and to aspire the liquid food from within. These flukes have very thick skins known as tegument, which is an adaptation to resist the responses of the host's immune system to try to break down the parasite as an intruder. The tegument is also highly folded into microvilli, increasing the surface area and favoring diffusion of nutritive fluids through the body wall directly into the parasite. The life cycle of these flukes involves an alternation between a reproductive host and a growth host, where the parasite either undergoes sexual reproduction or developmental growth, respectively. The host where the parasite will be reproducing is known as its definitive host. And the intermediate host is where the individual parasites will grow and develop or may increase their population size by asexual reproductive means. So one example is a liver fluke that may feed on humans that have caught it from eating raw fish, because the flukes in their larval form will embed into the muscles of the fish and form a cyst, in which they will remain dormant until the fish is eaten by a human who has not properly cooked that meat before ingesting it. Those cysts that are in the muscle of the fish will then emerge, develop into adult flukes, and feed on the human host for a while before reproducing. And then the eggs from within that human host will be released from the human through the feces. They find their way into the water column and will be picked up eventually by a snail feeding on underwater vegetation. That snail will then pass on those larvae to a secondary intermediate host when it gets eaten by a fish, where it will then form cysts in the fish's muscles to complete the life cycle once it gets eaten by another vertebrate, like a human having a meal of sushi. Yum yum! Another form of flatworm or platyhelminth parasite are the tapeworms in the Cystodia class. These tapeworms also feed off of ourselves, but do so in the intestinal lining, and they have these fierce heads made up of hooks that will latch onto the surface, including a number of suckers that will allow them to attach to the interior linings of our intestines. Their body is made up of a large number of repeated segments known as proglottids, which are essentially reproductive units. Each one of its proglottid segments can break free once it's fertilized and release a whole package of eggs into the environment as a means by which to rapidly increase the population size and hope for the successful colonization of a new host once those eggs are released into the environment. A typical life cycle of one of these tapeworms is that the adults lodge into the intestine and reproduce within that intestine, either with another sexual partner or via self-fertilization of these hermaphroditic proglottids. The whole segment containing all the fertilized eggs will be released from the tapeworm body and into the environment through the host's excrement and will be picked up by some secondary host in this case. For example, it could be picked up by some kind of crustacean feeding in contaminated waters, and then that crustacean might be eaten by a fish. If that fish were to be eaten by a human, well, this is another means by which we can transmit the endoparasite from the external environment back to its definitive or reproductive host, when we eat flesh that contains these parasites and without properly cooking them. Lastly, a very interesting kind of parasite are the parasitoids, which are insects that are commonly found among the fly or wasp orders, such as these two female Cotesia glomerata wasps that are interrupting the dinners of some cabbage leaf butterfly larvae by depositing their eggs into them. Those eggs will eventually hatch inside those unfortunate caterpillars and eat their way out. A parasitoid is a kind of organism that is parasitic in only one stage of its life cycle. In this stage, the parasitoid insects are parasitic in their larval phase. For the adult parasitoid, their parental care consists of locating a host for their offspring upon which they will lay their eggs, either on the surface of that host, in which case they're called ectoparasitoids, or inside that host, being an endoparasitoid. In both cases, it is placing the eggs in such a way that when the larvae emerge from that egg, they will have an immediate source of food to be able to begin feeding right away and to start their life off on a good footing. Incidentally, this endoparasitic life cycle was the basis for the idea behind the movie Alien, where the aliens would lay eggs inside the human host and developed in that larval immature phase, only to emerge later once having consumed enough of the host to be able to move on to their next stage in their life cycle, terrorizing the crew of the Nostromo.
So to sum up, parasitism can lead to a pretty successful lifestyle, as long as some important challenges are met, such as finding hosts, for example, or locating and getting access to reproductive partners to complete the life cycle through various compartments in the environment, such as a series of hosts like snails, fish, and if we're not careful, us.